Chocolate peanut butter cookie dough. Hoop, that is. Scoop, that is. Yeah, you know. What's up, guys? It's me, your old man professor, here to talk a little bit about Richard Pryor and his comedic endeavors. Um, got a lot of good comments from you guys, which I always appreciate. Keep it rolling. Keep keep churning them out, and I'll keep reading and responding to them via these videos. Um, a bun- a couple things about Pryor before I get into your comments and things like that we went over in class. This is mostly for those of you who are in the Thursday section, um, and those of you who don't pay attention to me on Tuesdays. A couple things. One is the story behind the performance that you saw. So that show was set to be filmed the day before, and this was Pryor's first performance post accident, um, post recovery, and all of that. And he literally like chickened out. Audience was all there, crowd was there in their seats, waiting for him to come out, and he just left. Couldn't do it. Too much at stake for him. And of course, only he knew what he was about to say. Too much at stake, right? And I've said this in class to everybody. Like, good comedy has something at stake for the performer and the audience. And it's crucial to identify what's at stake and, I don't know, sympathize, empathize, I don't know, with it. I don't know if that's the right term, but at least think about it. And 24 hours, they told the crowd, they sent him home and said, come back tomorrow. He was going to do it tomorrow. Same thing. And he did. Like, that's what you saw. It was after canceling, same crowd came back. And he did that, which was, that's one of the most famous sets in comedy history. Um, and for good reason. So there's that story that I think just adds to the the stakes, like I said before. Um, that all of that was at stake for him. And then he goes out and he talks about the things that he talks about. So it's like you're comparing him to, a comedian from today, like Gabriel Iglesias or Dane Cook or um, Kevin Hart. And it's like, what's at stake for those kinds of comedians? What's at stake, really? Um, I don't know. It doesn't seem like much. Which leads me to this other point that just infuriates me. So Kevin Hart has a special that's called "Laugh at My Pain," and I just think that is just the fact that he had the nerve when this existed. I'm sure he'd seen it before. Like, if anything, this should have been Richard Pryor laughing at my pain, right? Like, legitimate pain, and he gives it to us, gift wrapped in this, this ornate box. He gives it to us, and we are literally laughing at his pain. What is Kevin Hart's pain? He's short, right? Like, he's got too much money. he's in too many movies. I don't know. So I always found that ironic, if not blasphemous, that of all the comedians to have a special called "Laugh at My Pain," it's Kevin Hart, and here's Richard Pryor, literally inventing "Laugh at My Pain," and just no reference to it, no homage. So that's interesting. Another point is, and if you guys read the comments, I don't know if you do. Michaela brought this up, which I mentioned in classes. Pryor was in that sort of comedy machine, the mainstream comedy machine in the '60s. Carlin was in it. Pryor was in it. Lenny Bruce was in it to some extent. '50s and '60s, where it was comedy. The outlet for comedy was like late night TV, and you went on and you did a really, you did like a really rated G set. There's a lot of physical comedy. You were kind of just a clown for white people, basically. Um, and that was the path to success, at least mainstream success, was, you know, do your comedy, get noticed, get on a TV show, do spots on late night shows, and then maybe get your own show or get into the movies or musical comedy or whatever it was. So, Lenny Bruce, clear departure from that, right? Richard Pryor, clear departure from that. But what facilitated it was there was a moment where he was in that mode and he had a show in Vegas and he the story goes he goes out on stage and he grabs the mic and he looks out and it's just a room full of just old rich white people and he didn't even say a word. He was just like, I can't do this anymore. And it was a crisis of conscience, it was a crisis of identity, it was a crisis of like a cultural crisis where he was just like, what am I doing? I'm just a clown for these rich white people, and I'm better than that, and I have more to say than these silly jokes where they point and laugh. They're not laughing with me, they're laughing at me. That moment. So he's out on stage and it's this epiphany. And it's what I call, and I use it pretty universally across different concepts and ideas, but what he had there was a fuck it moment. And he realized he was at the precipice. He could either say fuck it, walk off the stage and be like, I'm not going to be your clown. I'm going to be me, and I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about in the way I want to talk about it. And I don't care what you think. Like, you can throw all of this fame and fortune, and I want to get it my way. I want to do it right, so to speak. Or he could have just laid down, did his jokes, got paid, and went home. And probably, not respected himself as much as he did before he did that. And if he continued to do that. And I say this all the time, like, most great things that have happened in the world, not just in comedy, came immediately following a fuck it moment where you're just like, fuck it. I hate the course that I'm on. I'm going to change it. And you'll all be there. You've all had them. You'll have them. Whether it's a job or a relationship or something that you're just sort of, you're kind of, sleepwalking through. But it's good enough. You'll hit the wall at some point and be like, you can either say fuck it and go do it how you should be doing it and chase your passion or your dream or whatever you want to call it. Or you can just be like, oh, I guess this is good enough. I'll just do this for the rest of my life. So you know, Pryor had a fuck it moment. And from that point on, his entire act changed, his appearance changed, his whole life changed. And generally, when you make that, you take that fuck it moment and you sort of try to actualize it, you end up, a lot of the time, you're happier for sure. But generally, your success sort of follows too. Um, Basically, there are more important things than fame and fortune. And a lot of comedians since Pryor, you can track this kind of development, right? I think any comedian worth his or her salt has gone through that. Where they're like, what am I doing? Like, this is, who cares about what I'm doing right now? I need to make this my thing, right? So it's like, fuck them, fuck it, let's do it. Um, so those are just two kind of background things going into this. For me, he brings up this idea of, and I probably mentioned it in class at some point, but this idea of opportunity versus responsibility, right? He's not responsible to sort of say any of these things, but as a good famous comedian, he has an opportunity to talk about sex and addiction and racism and all those kinds of things. So you have the opportunity, why not seize the opportunity? Right? You don't have to. It's not your responsibility. I would never say it's the responsibility of the entertainment industry or comedian or TV show or whatever to sort of guide us or teach us anything, or that they're responsible for any outcomes, like violent TV is responsible for violent people. Like that I don't buy, but you have an opportunity to impart wisdom and to be that kind of influence on people. Why not do it if it's in a positive way? Now, I think Pryor realized that was part of the fuck it moment. He's like, I don't have to talk about these things, but I can, and I will, because maybe people will listen and rethink and think about things differently as a result. And that's a win. That's a win-win. And just the topics that he talks about, and the frank nature in which he talks about them, race. I mean, these are in the 80s, but this is indicative of his comedy in the 70s too. Race, not just sexuality, but sex, meaning fucking, like the way he talks about fucking. Like, he just didn't do that in public, even in the early 80s and the 70s. It was coming around, I guess, but you didn't talk about it with that sort of bluntness. Gender and addiction. I mean, the big takeaway from this set has to be his approach to addiction and the fallout from addiction, what it's done to his life. Like, we barely talk about addiction now, right? When you think about the opioid epidemic and, just the different waves of there was the crack epidemic, then there was, now all the marijuana stuff, legalizing, not legalizing, and just the drug topic altogether has always been there. But only recently have we really started to talk about addiction as a disease and how to treat it, instead of just throwing everybody in fucking jail. And here he is talking about it in like a very real way and a very practical way. And I think it served, I think it was helpful to him but I think it had an opportunity to be helpful to millions, hundreds of thousands of people who are watching, who saw that show. Um, it's interesting, definitely. Like, I think that's a big takeaway from it. It's just so far ahead of his time talking about addiction in a very real way. Um, Humor provides access to ideas otherwise unapproachable, I think. I've probably said that in class before, but Pryor, I think, really exemplifies this this notion. Um, these are difficult conversations to have, and comedy when these issues are handled in in ways when these issues are handled by somebody like Pryor, right, who's keeping it light, but sort of like, you know, sticking and moving, like throwing jabs of meaning in between the jokes and sort of giving you a rhythm and things like that, we're more open to it, right? We can relate to it more. We can sort of let our guard down, and we're listening, we're thinking, we're laughing, we're sort of in an almost euphoric state, and I think it's just a better environment in which to exchange ideas and thought and information. And that's humor. Humor does that across the board, not just Richard Pryor. He is sort of an arbiter of it, but good comedy can always provide that. Um, a bunch of you mentioned like you can hear the connection between Pryor and Eddie Murphy and Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle. Like there's a lineage for sure. Whether it's the way they talk, their cadence, their sort of their approach to humor and topics like they have, or the tie-ins with the N-word that bridges Pryor and Chappelle. Chappelle talked about that a lot with Chappelle's show. People misinterpreting his use of the word. He's using it to deconstruct it and take the piss out of it and try to expose stereotypes and racism for what they are, which is unnecessary and ridiculous and hurtful. And a lot of people misinterpreted that. And they're like, oh, Chappelle's saying the N-word on TV. Guess it's fair game. And white people coming up to him, like they both talk about this. Pryor brings it up. He's like, I don't need no white people coming up to me and calling me that or saying that, like, even in a friendly way, because that's not what it's for. Chappelle said almost the same thing when at the height of the Chappelle show. So those are interesting connections to make, and sad because it means nobody learned anything from any of it, right? A couple of you mentioned that, like this Pryor show sounds like it could be on Netflix right now. You could see it. It's very Pryor sounds like what good comedy would become, right? I think years and years ahead of it. Sort of, you can hear it. So those connections, I think, are always interesting to make. Pryor versus Cosby. I'll do another video on Cosby for a couple of days for you guys, just to synthesize all that. But yeah, they were polar opposites. And I think what they sort of highlight without even saying it is like there aren't even two ways to be a black man in America. Right? There's the Pryor way. They both give you these examples. There's the Pryor way, which is very much more stereotypical, right? Um, and then there's the Cosby way, which doesn't look like what most of us, conjure in our heads when we think of the black man in America in the 1980s. Like, we just don't. And I don't think, yeah, they represent blackness in very different ways, which to me, you know, contributes to this idea that there's no one way to be a thing. And this applies to your race or your gender or your sexuality or whatever it is. There's no one defining characteristic that would include everybody in a certain group. Does that make sense? That's important to note because we love to assume that there are, in fact, there are several things that apply to every group. And there's one way to be black. And if you're not it, then go fuck yourself. That's where much of Cosby's criticism came from that. Like, he's not black enough. Well, what does that mean? Well, no, I don't. Tell me what you mean without being the most racist person in the world. And then that usually shuts people up. But I'll talk more about Pryor and Cosby in the next video. Comedy uses pain to promote joy, understanding, and perspective. I think Pryor sort of gave us a roadmap to that, right? His pain inevitably should promote joy, understanding, and perspective, right? If you're watching that show and you're like, oh my God, like this, you forget about his pain, but you're getting joy from it, laughing at his stories and his depictions, but you're also understanding addiction more. You're understanding that kind of pain, and you get this perspective. It's a different perspective on drugs and addiction and things like that. So using pain to promote those things, I think, it's a wonderful sort of byproduct of comedy and humor. Now, I got some specific stuff that you guys wrote down that I thought was interesting. Drew made this connection that Lenny Bruce was fighting against the government or law enforcement or the establishment, whatever you want to call it, to be able to say what he wants to say. And Pryor was fighting against himself to decide if he could or should say what he was saying, right? Which is, that in and of itself is a luxury, right? But what did Pryor do with Bruce's fight? He was like, I can now say what I want to say because of him. What am I going to do as a result of that fight? Am I going to just use it sort of superficially and, be everybody's clown and say ridiculous, obnoxious things because I can? Or am I going to take the baton and, and run it to the next guy forward? It's interesting. And I liked that comparison. Pryor's fight was with himself primarily. And I think we win, right? Because he chose to do something with this freedom and expand on this freedom, not just, reduce the freedom to the lowest common denominator. Ariel brought up the therapeutic nature of humor just in general, which I think is an important um, concept to think about, right? It, this had to feel good for Pryor to say, to get these things off his chest, and to, you know, just get everything. You guys know, you've been in situations where you're like just bottling something in. The moment you say it, it's like, I'm not carrying that with me anymore. And I think Pryor is doing that here. And we should also be a part of that. If we're an audience watching, like, there should be a therapeutic element to humor. They say it's the best medicine. Now, I can neither confirm nor deny that, as I have never been prescribed it by a doctor. But, you know, I think this is more where that saying comes from. Mental health, I think it helped a great deal. Um, Jackie, I appreciated you sharing your story about um, your grandmother. Is it your grandmother, Jackie? Yep, grandma. I got it. I got it. Um, and the whole the psychology of the burn burn victims and things like that, and that was just interesting, an interesting connection. And I'm glad you were able to make it. Um, we all need a wake up call. Like, that was my takeaway from your comment. We all need a wake up call, right? Or we need to get to the fuck it moment, and we need to be confident enough and strong enough to say fuck it and not say, not turn the other way or look the other way. My thought was, maybe this performance, for the people in that audience or the people who saw it at the time, or even you guys, maybe some of you guys, maybe this performance, can provide that wake up call without people getting hurt, right? That's what I always thought was one of the strengths of comedy, was like, it's just jokes here. Nobody's getting hurt. Nobody's dying. Nobody's really in, in dire straits as a result of it. It's a great place for these things to be discussed and play out, and sort of think about these things. So, if we all need a wake up call, maybe comedy, this performance, but comedy as a whole, like, whatever it is that you think is funny and you enjoy, maybe that can be the wake up call. If it's good comedy and it's sort of, is trying to make you think and rethink your life and your values and your decisions and who you are, maybe it can provide that wake up call. So, yeah, Jackie, that was a thoughtful comment. I appreciated that. And then Logan, yeah, it's kind of like before Drew said Bruce fighting versus the government, Pryor fighting against himself. Logan had a different spin on that. Bruce was fighting to be heard. Pryor was fighting for change. Maybe change. I struggled when I was writing it down to come up with the right term. But Bruce was fighting to be heard. Period. having had that fight, Pryor didn't have to fight to be heard. Maybe he had to fight for credibility or to be listened to. Maybe that's it. That's it. Bruce had to fight to be heard. Pryor had to fight to be listened to. And not taken seriously, but you know what I mean? Like, for Pete to get over that, oh, he's just a comedian thing, right? So Bruce does his thing, Pryor takes it and elevates it, doesn't diminish it in any way by just, taking advantage of the fact that he can say motherfucker all the time, which he did, but that, that's not the basis of the show. Doesn't take it backwards, takes it and moves the needle forward. So yeah, that's what I want to say. That's what I'll leave you with now. Bruce was fighting to be heard. Pryor was fighting to be listened to. Yeah. Comedy.